So today I'm going to give a brief overview of the drought governance arrangements in the UK with a focus on England. And I'm specifically going to give a bit of an update on the work that we've been doing in workstream A2, and that's Dr. Bettina Langa and Dr. Chris Decker and me, Dr. Christina Cook. And our project is about understanding how drought and water scarcity are regulated. So I wanted to start with a picture of what privatised water provision in England looks like. These are the key actors. We have the government ministry, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We have three regulators, an environmental regulator, a quality regulator, and an economic regulator. Then we have the water supply and sewerage providers, and that's water companies. Some in England are water-only suppliers, and some are water and sewerage suppliers. We have third-party experts. Those are consultants, and then we have consumer, customer, citizens, which are you and me and various commercial interests that would be in need of water provision. Also important statutory actors are Natural England and the Consumer Council for Water, but they won't be the focus of this discussion today. So on A2, what are we doing and so what? Our objective is to understand how regulatory tools and related practices work. In essence, this is how does the law work in practice? It may say something in legislation and in the regulations, but typically it doesn't work exactly as it reads in the legislation, or there are nuances in institutional arrangements that aren't easy to understand by reading the legislation. So our goal is to advance the analysis of the key regulatory tools and related knowledge practices by understanding them as part of a wider governance space. The so what of our work is that the mapping of the governance space should help to identify specific points at which different or enhanced knowledge practices can make the most difference. So we hope to contribute to advancing adaptive governance for drought and water scarcity, and we hope to inform a greater integration of environmental science and economics knowledge practices to support resilience. How are we working in A2? We're mapping the governance space in a three-part study. We're looking at drought planning by water companies. We're looking at the preliminary program of abstraction reform. So that's the Restoring Sustainable Abstraction Program, which is I refer to as preliminary because we are expecting in the UK by the early 2020s an overhaul of abstraction licensing as it is now, and that's the big abstraction reform project that DEFRA is undertaking. And our third case study is a historic experience of drought permits and orders. And by historic, we mean here in the last two droughts in the UK, so from 2003 to 2006 and from 2010 to 2012. And how do we do this? Well, we're looking at documentary analysis. So we look at academic literature, we look at government policy, and water company documents that are in the public domain. We're doing regulatory analysis, and we're also doing some empirical work, which is interviewing key people at water companies, at regulators, various consultants, and various abstractors who are also involved in the abstraction reform processes. So the focus of today's presentation is on drought planning. And specifically, we're looking in England rather than looking in Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. So moving on to what we're actually doing in A2, I'm going to show you a map of drought planning in England. So I've taken some of these actors that you saw in the first diagram in this presentation and put them into relation with each other. So you'll see the UK government, DEFRA, the Environment Agency, Ofwat, the water companies, customer citizens, and then at the side are consultants and Natural England, Consumer Council for Water, and the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So I've added the EU in because there is some steer from the European Union with regard to water resources management planning, and it's found in three separate directives: the Water Framework Directive, the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, and the Habitats Regulation Directive. So then I've also added into this slide the DEFRA legislation and policies, which the EU interprets and produces a drought plan guidance from, which then water companies rely on in order to prepare their water company drought plans. And I've got some dotted lines in there to show the relationships between those different legislative or policy instruments and how they relate to the drought plans. With respect to the EU impact on drought planning in the UK, as I said, there's three directives, and they have different influences, and our work has shown that these tools are viewed differently by water companies. So for now, the Water Framework Directive isn't playing a major role, and that's in part because it allows for temporary deteriorations in water quality. So it sort of provides, in the words of one of our interview participants, a get-out clause for drought plans needing to comply with the Water Framework Directive. But that may change. There is new EA guidance on drought planning that may require that water companies have greater reference to the Water Framework Directive. Strategic environmental assessments, there seems to be some uncertainty as to whether they apply to drought plans in the water industry because some people see them as not being strictly required on an operational plan, such as the drought management plan. However, we are seeing that some water companies do use strategic environmental assessments on drought plans, and in part this may be simply to manage the relationship with the regulator rather than seeing them having a really substantial impact on how they construct their drought plan. But this is in contrast to the habitats regulation assessments, which seem to be more useful for water companies in understanding the sort of cumulative impact of the drought management options that they're selecting. Of course, all this has to be understood in the context of different water company patches, and that is that drought management options will be more or less relevant based on particular factors. So, for example, the geology and geography of a water company's area will dictate different drought management options. So this includes what the mix of groundwater, surface water, and coastal location is, but it also includes, how many environmental sites, European sites, domestic environmental sites exist within the water company, and how does that influence what options they have. The customer base may be important in choosing drought management options because there are different tools that apply to domestic and commercial customers. The degree of meter penetration amongst domestic customers may be important in terms of what effect temporary use bans may have on demand. And that's because the more people are metered, usually the more efficient and more conserving of water they are. And so when you put on a temporary use ban, you may get less response than you would in a community where people don't typically use or don't have meters. The past experience that a water company has with a drought can be important to understanding what drought management options they'll choose. If something's been successful, they'll go back to it. If it hasn't, they may not. Experience is useful. Whether it can also restrict the kind of options thinking that water companies do is an open question. The degree of grid network that a water company has, the extent of that grid network can really influence drought management options as well. And finally, social discourse. So what's the UK public's expectation of water services? If you read company drought plans, you'll find that there's a reference to levels of service and a suggestion that in 2013 or 2014, 2015, the years in which these plans are written, that the water companies are reporting that customers are not going to be tolerant of something such as a standpipe, which was the way that the 1976 drought was managed. A little bit more about drought management options. First, I want to say that supply-side measures obviously are to get more water into the system, and demand-side measures are to conserve water use and possibly increase efficiency. How the measures are used and in what balance will be unique in each water company, and it's in part because of legislation and guidance that water companies choose drought management options, but it's also about things like context, as I just spoke about on the last slide, as well as environmental, economic, and experiential knowledges that a water company might have. So looking more closely at those options, I've chosen three to speak about a little bit more and refer to the legal institution that they're guided by. So temporary use bans work on demand management, and they're now governed by the Water Use Temporary Bans Order 2010. So this is an option now that water companies can apply temporary use bans without needing to consult either the Environment Agency or the Secretary of State. Drought permits relate to increasing the amount of supply that water companies can access, and that's found in the Water Resources Act, Section 79A. And drought orders, which include non-essential use bans that apply to demand, and they also may affect supply, are found in the Water Resources Act, Sections 73 to 79. So temporary use bans require decision-making on priority uses and users, and they must be used before a drought permit or order is applied for. So they're kind of a second stage drought management option. They're usually used after a water company has embarked on a publicity campaign to encourage all customers to be mindful of the kind of water usage that's appropriate during a drought onset. And things like temporary use bans include watering a garden or cleaning a private motor vehicle or filling a domestic swimming pool with a hose pipe. So you could still water your garden or clean your motor vehicle with a bucket and a sponge, but you wouldn't be able to use a hose pipe to do that. So here I've just listed out the 11 categories of uses that are subject to temporary use bans, and I won't read through them, though you'll be familiar with many of them, and I just would say that a temporary use ban will typically be applied to a water resource zone, which is the area within which the management of supply and demand is largely self-contained. And it means that the supply infrastructure and demand centers are generally integrated to the extent that all customers in a water resource zone should experience the same risk of supply failure and therefore share the same level of service. Drought permits really only address supply, and they're something water companies apply for to authorize the taking of the source, taking more water from a source in a permit, or to suspend any restrictions that they may have regarding that supply source. So the water company applies to the Environment Agency for a drought permit, and they do it when they think that they can say that an exceptional shortage of rain has caused a serious deficiency or threatens to cause a serious deficiency. Drought orders really sit at the top of the pyramid of drought order options. They are not granted very often, and they're not applied for very often. And they can restrict use and impact abstractions and discharges. And both the EA and water companies can apply to the Secretary of State for a drought order, and in this case it's based on the reason of exceptional shortage of rain. And there's two levels. There's an ordinary drought order or an emergency drought order. So the non-essential use bans that could be part of a water company ordinary drought order include this list of activities, but they'll look really familiar. It's just, they're like the temporary use ban categories, only in this case they're applied to commercial customers, and they require really thinking through what the potential economic impacts could be. So banning watering of outdoor plants in a commercial context could really affect nurseries, for example. Banning the cleaning of windows could really affect window washing companies. So here we start to see the complexity of what it means to implement a drought order, and also gives us some reference as to why in the legislation the DEFRA has said water companies need to have as little recourse as possible to these kinds of regulatory options, because they have real impacts on people's lives and businesses. So finally, I want to return to the map of drought governance space, and I showed you this a little bit earlier. And one of the things that's coming out of our work, which is still in process, is that this real relationship with consultants with just about everybody in this regulatory space. So that says something interesting about how knowledge practices flow, and what knowledge practices, either environmental or economic or both, as well as experience knowledge, gets prioritized. So that's something we're continuing to explore. And in this governance map, the arrows that are double-sided and in black really show the flow of information and legal resources, and that's what our work is about. The A2 takeaways are that we're mapping the governance space of drought and water scarcity in the UK. And today I've focused on England because that's where our work is most advanced. We're seeking to identify the specific points at which different or enhanced knowledge practices can make the most difference. and we're contributing to adaptive governance for drought and water scarcity and a greater integration of environmental science and economics knowledges for resilience. Thank you.